Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me once again. What a weekend. I mean, what a season this is turning out to be. I mean, is this not one of the best Formula One seasons in our recent memory? I mean, tell me if you think I'm over-exaggerating, but we are getting incredible race after incredible race this year. There's stuff going on track and off track. I mean, we've got so much to talk about, so I hope you loved the weekend. I mean, who thought we'd be saying that after a Russian Grand Prix around Sochi? But it had a bit of everything, right from the beginning of the weekend all the way through to the end of that Grand Prix. And my goodness, what an end of that Grand Prix it was. It was just spectacular. I hope nobody walked away before the end of that race. I hope you didn't have to go out, or I hope you didn't have a power cut, or your signal disappeared on your TV, because my goodness, you missed a dramatic finish if you did. Hello to you all, first of all, from all over the world. Thank you very much for joining. For those of you who watched Wheel of Dealers tonight, I hope you enjoyed it. It was one of my favourite episodes. Colin the Camper, I just loved every minute of that. I thought it was brilliant. It was brilliant fun to make that show. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't seen it, go check it out on Catch Up on Discovery Channel or Discovery Plus app. Right, let's talk about Formula One. Where do you want to start with this? Because, I mean, so many questions I've had over the course of the last 24 hours around that decision from Lando and McLaren to stay out on slicks at the end of the race when everyone else was diving in for intermediate tyres. So let's start there and we'll get your comments as we go, and I'll dive in and out of the comments all the way through. But hello and welcome. You're all saying hello. Thank you. I appreciate you all joining. Really, I do. So let's talk about that then, because I know this is going backwards in the course of the weekend, but it was such a dramatic finish. Lots of people saying, first of all, a lot of people telling me that McLaren got it wrong. A lot of people saying Lando got it wrong, and it's the experience of Lewis Hamilton that eventually won through in that Grand Prix. And of course, there may well be elements of all of those things. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. But what I would say, if we start to pick it apart, is that first of all, those decisions are always the hardest to make when you're leading the race. How many times have we had Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes leading that race, or leading a race, where it becomes so much harder for them to make the first call? Because if you're sitting behind them, you can either react to what the car in front has done, you can react to other people. You're not essentially giving up the best track position on the racetrack, which Lando would have been if he dived into the pits. And on top of that, so that makes the decision hard, first of all. But on top of that, of course, you know, there's all these elements around things like weather forecasting. And they're all using the same weather radar. But on top of that, many of the teams have their own weather systems as well, their own spotters, their own people feeding information into the model to help them base their decisions upon. Mercedes seemed to have a fairly clear understanding that the rain was going to get worse, whereas perhaps McLaren didn't, or weren't as confident in that decision. And then, of course, there were the two drivers. Now, Lewis Hamilton, again, has an easier decision to make for two reasons in that scenario. First of all, he's not leading the race. As I said before, it's an easier place to make that call from. When the guy in front has already made his decision, you can react to that. But much more critically, in this situation, Lewis Hamilton, although it looked like it, and this was the battle we were all focused on, Lewis Hamilton wasn't in a race with Lando Norris to the same extent that he was in a race with Max Verstappen. And so when Max Verstappen dived into the pits before Lewis Hamilton did, well, of course, Lewis was then able to react to that, because that's the one that he had to shadow. He only had to finish ahead of Max Verstappen for that to be a successful weekend for him. So when Max dived into the pits, even if it meant losing out in a potential battle for the race win, he would copy the strategy that Max was on and therefore put himself onto the same rough performance level as Max was. And therefore, whether it worked out or not, he would not have a net loss to Max Verstappen, which would have been the greater worry for them. So it was a very, very different decision for Lewis and Mercedes than it was for McLaren and Norris. Also, Mercedes had Valtteri Bottas switch tyres earlier on and had some feedback, of course, from that. I think they were the first team to go on Valtteri's car, so they had early feedback and knowledge from what Valtteri was doing to feed into the decision for Lewis as well. So all round, it's not quite as simple as it might have looked on the TV, that it was simply about the decisions from the two drivers. Lando was basing his decision on what he felt in the car, but that didn't take into consideration the fact the rain was going to start coming down much heavier. Lewis was under a very different set of instructions from his team based on those things that I've just talked to you about, knowing that Max had pitted and knowing what Valtteri had done on his tyres too. So it's not quite as straightforward as it looked, but let's not forget that, of course, driver experience definitely plays a part in this. And off the back of all of this, heartbreaking though it was for Lando and all of his many followers and everybody at McLaren, they will all come out much stronger from this. They'll all learn from this. There are lots of things that can be learnt from any errors that might have been made so that they can potentially not make those next time. It's something Formula One teams are very, very good at. McLaren's first bad pit stop was the reason for Lando not winning at the end. Lewis had the positioning, had everything went well. Danny Rick could have slowed him up a bit more. No, it's not. McLaren's bad pit stop was not the reason that Lando didn't win that race. I mean, that's a far-fetched way of looking at it, I'm afraid. There were a number of reasons, but the primary one is simply that they reacted in the wrong way with hindsight to the weather. The weather changed incredibly quickly. It was one of those knife-edge calls. Some teams and drivers got it right, some didn't. Unfortunately, as I said, it's the hardest decision to make when you're leading the race, and they erred on the side of on the wrong side as we now look back on it. But it could have very easily gone differently. If the rain hadn't got any worse, then it would have been Lewis and Mercedes that looked a little bit more silly, and Lando would have tiptoed his way around to victory. But if it had gone that way, Lewis would have still been on the same tyre as Max and therefore not lost out in the championship. That is why it was so much more of an easy call for them to make. So many bad pit stops. Pit stops are definitely, the teams are struggling a little bit with this, and I've talked about this a number of times now in the last couple of weeks, but you know, they've been drilled into doing pit stops thousands of times for years, the same kind of way. And all of a sudden we've had to change because the regulations have changed, made some slight tweaks to the procedures. It only takes a slight tweak when you're pre-programmed to do something a certain way ever so long and so many times, and it's so quick that, you know, there are occasions when your pre-programming will kick in and you'll do something the old way. And I think that's clearly what's happened on a couple of occasions up and down the pit lane. The irony being that, of course, this change in procedure was there to make things safer, and of course when something goes wrong, even if it's actually delaying a pit stop and slowing it down, what tends to happen is that panic sets in and mistakes are made. Drivers can get released into the path of another car, and potentially it can even get more dangerous when that happens. But it will settle itself down, I have no doubt. Jerome Beek says, no, Lando didn't fail in my point of view. This is a steep learning curve for him. I'm not saying Lando failed at all. I'm not saying that's the reason at all. You know, Lando didn't fail. Lando drove an incredible weekend from start to finish. And, you know, let's take a moment in a second to discuss that, how good McLaren and particularly Lando were this weekend. So yes, it's a hugely steep learning curve for him and the team. But as I said, those moments when things go wrong can be so valuable. You know, if any of you listen to my audio podcast about dealing with failure, this is exactly what McLaren will be doing today. Last night and today is assessing what happened, trying to figure out what they could do better. And as a result of what happened yesterday, in the future, they will be much stronger. Lando will be much stronger. So, you know, much as it's hard to take in the moment, over a longer period of time, these are the moments that end up generating and building the great champions and the great championship winning team. So it will turn out to be a stepping stone on the way to whatever success either of those two have in terms of McLaren and Lando. But it's hard to take when it happens to you. Right, hold on, sorry, comments are flying through. Does every team have the same weather radar? Well, as I said, they all use the same centralised weather radar now. It used to be that everyone had their own kit. I mean, when I was at McLaren, we had a fully kitted out weather radar vehicle, a van, that was like a sort of Bond vehicle, because it looked like a plain van from the outside, but you'd open it up and it was just computerized gizmos everywhere, giant satellite dish that popped up from the roof, and we'd send him off up into the hills around the circuit, the weather guy, to go and, you know, gather as much information, and he'd be feeding that back. We'd also have people, spotters, around the perimeters of the circuits and the neighbouring towns, feeding back in information about weather coming in our direction, how far away the rain was, what intensity it was at. Then what happened was F1 centralised the weather radar process. So everyone now gets the same weather radar feed, but you are still able, if you really want to go and add to that information you're getting by sending people out and using other sources of weather information too. And of course people do that. But that image you see on everyone's screen on the pit wall is a central common weather radar that everyone gets. Hang on, right. Why Red Bull didn't undercut Lewis with Perez when they were in the DRS train behind Daniel? Undercut was powerful and could hold Lewis up to allow Max to undercut both of them, who was roughly 2 seconds behind. Yeah, so Red Bull did have that option. They could have at one stage undercut Lewis with Sergio, but of course, don't forget Sergio was on a slightly different strategy in terms of that would have really compromised his race even more. And if you think about it, before the rain came, Sergio made the wrong call, or Red Bull and Sergio made the wrong call with the rain tyres at the end, and he dropped, I think he finished 8th in the end, didn't he? But no, was it 8th? No, further down than that. He dropped all the way down. But actually, in the dry section of the race, Sergio had made amazing progress on a slightly different strategy, and he was on for a potential podium himself. So, you know, that would have been a real compromise to his race. Now, of course, they're in a championship battle, but I think Max was doing an incredible job working his way through the field on his own, that it was one of those things where perhaps they could have done it. They chose not to. I can kind of understand both sides of it. I don't think it would have made quite the difference that everyone thinks it would have made to Max versus Lewis's race, because at the time they weren't necessarily right next to each other. But it was one of those things I did question at the time. It's probably something they could have done. It was an option they had. Surely Max is favourite now. Even if Lewis doesn't need an engine swap, Max has a new engine. Well, look, this idea of favourites is going to ebb and flow as the season goes on. It's incredibly close. But what Max did, of course, over this weekend was essentially take a free engine with minimal loss to Lewis Hamilton because of the way the race played out. I mean, who would have thought he'd have finished second on the racetrack to Lewis winning that Grand Prix? So that's an incredible damage limitation exercise. Now, the challenge, and obviously that's also, given that Max was at the back, Mercedes were able to take that strategic penalty with Valtteri. I don't believe it was there to hold Max up in any way. I mean, Valtteri didn't do that in any way, shape or form. But it was an opportunity, given that because Max was essentially out of the picture, starting all that way back, Mercedes didn't need both of their cars in a straight fight at the front. Didn't need two cars to take on the might of Red Bull and Max Verstappen in the same way they might at some other racetracks. And so they were able to take that strategic penalty. What they didn't really account for, and I don't think anyone accounted for, is the fact that Max would have made his way that far forward. They took a setup on Max's car. Because they didn't need to take part in qualifying properly, they could set the car up purely for the race, and that meant a very low drag setup that was allowing them to pass cars much more easily than some other cars were able to do. And somehow they managed to make tyres last quite well, even without that increased downforce level, which was impressive. It was one of the things I was most impressed at, because I thought they would struggle in that regard. And so, you know, Mercedes have essentially lost out here a little bit. Yes, they've got an extra engine in the pot for Valtteri, and in the end he got a decent result out of this with the way that the rain panned out at the end. But Red Bull have got the new engine for Max in the pot and lost out minimally in points. Lewis Hamilton is almost certainly going to need another engine at some point throughout this season. So where does he take it? How on earth is he going to factor that into a race where it's almost certain, or very likely, he won't get the same level of damage limitation that Max had this weekend? So from that, you might say that it's Mercedes that have had a net loss throughout that little exchange of races over the last few, where engine penalties have been a kind of factor. So perhaps an absolute stroke of genius from Red Bull, perhaps a little bit of luck with the way certain things panned out too, but there's still a long way to go. There are some Red Bull favourite circuits coming up, but there are also some Mercedes ones too. I think it's too early to call. I have no idea which way it's going to go. And look, it may well be that Lewis doesn't need another engine. It's just that the chances are he probably will. But that's not necessarily going to be the defining moment of the season. we could actually find that this could still swing. One DNF from either of those two drivers and the whole thing changes again, of course. Oh yeah, how about, okay, Rob Graham, this is a good one. I did want to talk about this. How about Alonso straight lining turn 2 on lap 1? Should it have been a penalty? So my first reaction was, he can't do that. But of course it's lap 1 and there's this whole sort of slightly grey area when it comes to lap 1. The stewards give a huge amount of leniency because the alternative to him going off there was probably to crash. So his only way of avoiding contact with other cars in that melee at the start, and this is so often the case, is to bail out of the corner, which is what he did. Now, when you bail out of that particular corner, you know, and your momentum takes you across that corner rather than going round it, you are going to create a lasting advantage for yourself. But it's very difficult to go back and penalise that because it's the first lap of the race and all sorts of stuff is going on. And if you penalise that, there's probably 100 other incidents you have to start penalising. So I think Alonso kind of lucked out with that one. He kind of got away with it. It did gain him a whole handful of places at the start. But look, it's Fernando Alonso. Was he being clever or was it just a set of circumstances that went his way this week? You decide. Max got away with his grid penalty. Should a driver's penalty carry over to the next race or a team penalty if the driver starts on the back of the grid anyway? Josh Smith with that one. So I think that it's just the way it worked out. It's a bit of a loophole, but look, he started at the back of the grid. I mean, that's the biggest penalty you can get. And I know that that is the penalty you get for taking an engine, but it's not that he got away without his 3 places. I mean, it's just that you can't go any further back than the back of the grid. And for me, that's just the way it works out. So, you know, you win some, you lose some. Yes, of course, they were strategic in taking the engine here and it obviously worked out for them in the end. But for the sake of 3 places, I'm not sure we should be rolling that on. I like to see penalties done and dusted and then let's move on as quickly as possible. Alonso practiced it on the formation lap, I think. Yeah, I've seen a few people say this, that Alonso actually did the same thing on the formation lap. I must admit I didn't clock that, but maybe he was practicing and figuring out how to do it. Who knows? 3-engine allocation, is that over-ambitious? Well, it's not over-ambitious. It perhaps is over-ambitious in terms of the teams haven't been ready for it, haven't been well enough prepared for it, but it's not that it's not doable. You know, you can make an engine last for an entire season if you want to. You just have to downgrade the performance to suit. The teams are reluctant to do that, and so they're pushing the envelope in terms of performance and costing themselves the longevity of that engine. So it's very much a decision that teams have to make and get that balance right. So I don't think it's over-ambitious in terms of the rules, because it's definitely doable. It is perhaps been over-ambitious from the team's perspective on, you know, how far they want to peg back their engine in favour of getting more life out of it. And, you know, there might be an argument to say that winning races with a more powerful engine and then taking a penalty on one particular race might, over the course of a season, be more advantageous to you. And maybe that's something they've weighed up. What makes the intermediate tyre so versatile, says George Alimo? Well, the intermediate tyre it's very versatile in certain conditions, but it still has a window. And outside of that window, you know, when it gets too dry, it gets destroyed very quickly. If it's too wet, like extreme wet, it simply can't disperse enough water and you will still aquaplane off. But it does have this nice sweet spot that's still relatively wide from being pretty damp on the racetrack to relatively intense rain. And it's just down to the depth of the grooves in the tyre and the design of those grooves in how quickly and how much water it can disperse out of the channels in the top of that, in the surface of the tyre. So it seems to be a very good design. It's a bit more versatile in terms of temperature as well. So they are still temperature sensitive, but much less so than, say, the dry tyres that we're much more used to talking about. So it seems to be a good tyre, and as you said, it works in quite a wide range of conditions, but it's simply or mostly down to that design of the tread and how it disperses the water from the track. What about downgrading the pit stops? Well, sort of touched on that. I mean, yes, these changes to the regulations that are there to deliberately slow down pit stops are doing just that, but some of the teams are struggling to get their heads around it, or it's not even getting their heads around it. They are practicing more so than ever before to try and reprogram the automation that was built into all of these guys and girls in delivering those pit stops. But even so, after doing it years one way, you're always going to have the occasional failure, and it's happening. Hi from Melbourne, says David Barbaro. Hello, David. Hi to you too. Welcome along. What happened to Red Bull pit stop? So I think it was same sort of thing. I think it was another similar incident that we've had before. As I said, talking about these new procedures. I actually don't know the explicit details of that one, so I can't really comment. Maria Holland, where are your little tyres? Yeah, they're not. I haven't got them here tonight. And Maria, I know I said this last week, didn't I? I'm really sorry. Still haven't sent your parcel. But what I have done is packaged it up, so we're closer. And I'm really sorry. That's terrible of me. I have packaged up the parcel of the F1 fragrances that you luckily won on this channel a few weeks ago now, and it will be heading your way. So please accept my apologies. It's coming very soon. I promise you'll get it this week. How about that? Right. Max can pull back and race smart. Saved his race by millimetres when Leclerc cut him off. Yeah, so that was close, wasn't it? When Max and Charles Leclerc came very close to wiping out each other very early in the race. So that was a sign of Max, getting it right. Whereas quite often he hasn't got it right in those situations, but he did this week. And that's all part of this experience coming through, I would say. What do you think of Bottas's tactical engine change? Well, as I said just a moment ago, I think it was probably a well thought out decision by Mercedes at the time. The difference between, I think first of all, they didn't think that it would be that hard for Valtteri to make his way through the field. Now, partly that might be down to Valtteri, maybe not being aggressive enough or as aggressive as, say, a Max making his way through the field. But as I said before, on Max's car, they went for a very deliberate low drag, low downforce setup, which allowed him to gain a lot more top end speed and overtake either along the straights or around that very long sweeping turn 3. I don't think they did the same sort of thing on Valtteri's car, certainly not to the same extent, and perhaps that was another factor. But the fact that he took the engine penalty and then wasn't able to make his way through the field in the dry conditions probably hurt him quite a lot more than they thought. Thanks for accepting my apologies, Maria. I promise it's coming your way. Right, what about Toto saying you can still finish 5th to Bottas driving round in P4 and then he gets 5th in the end? Yeah, I don't think even Toto Wolff towards the latter stages of that race would have believed that Valtteri could have got 5th, and amazing that he did. But of course they played it very right. They played the right call on the rain with almost nothing to lose, of course. An even more extreme example of what we were talking about earlier at the front, with Valtteri all the way back down in outside of the points with literally no points to lose. They could roll the dice and gamble with a very early tyre switch, and they kind of got it just right. And that early tyre switch was really what catapulted him up through the field. So it worked out well in the end, but I think we all sort of took a double take when we heard Toto saying, Valtteri, you can finish 5th, because I'm not even sure he believed it at the time. So do you think Lewis can get away without taking penalties before the end of the season? No, as I said before, I don't think he can. I think he will have to take some. So yes, that's just something that's coming his way. He's got to find an opportunity to take it. Where should Hamilton take his engine penalty, assuming he needs to take one? Well, I don't know. As I say, I think it's one of those things that it's a very difficult one, and they will end up having to sort of be strategic, and it might be in a similar way to the way that Valtteri took his as a bit of a late call. They might want to do the same thing on an occasion. If there comes a race where Max suddenly finds himself at the back, either through a disastrous qualifying or a crash or having to take a penalty of his own, it may be that they'll throw in a late call and chuck another engine into the pool for Lewis to take the penalty at that particular race, knowing that he's only got to really race against Max. So it is a difficult one to work out what to do, because the alternative there, of course, is to stay up at the front, try and capitalise on the full 25 points where Max is down the back. So it's going to be really hard for them to do that. And that's why I said, out of this whole engine penalty scenario over the last few races, it's Red Bull that have been the net winners, given that their damage limitation was top notch yesterday. Good to see Daniel in 4th place. Yeah, so let's talk about McLaren. So it was good to see Daniel in 4th. Another decent weekend. I mean, not quite on Lando's level, but that's the way it's been over the course of this season. But we are seeing signs of Daniel definitely improving and getting more confident. I thought he raced very well. So look, McLaren, and this is where, let's get onto this, because McLaren really are turning a corner. And the reason I titled this video, F1's changing of the guard, ? It's not really just about yesterday's race, but we're starting to see some genuine contenders coming out of the shadows, aren't we? We're seeing Lando Norris challenging genuinely on pace, challenging for pole positions and race wins now. We're seeing McLaren kind of as a whole, as a team, doing the same, being a genuine contender on certain occasions, on certain circuits. We are seeing the likes of, obviously, Max taking the fight in the championship to Lewis. So the guard is changing. We've got George Russell coming through to be Lewis's teammate next year. I mean, what qualifying from him, by the way, on Saturday to stick it in 3rd. That's going to be a real exciting part of next year, seeing George Russell alongside Lewis in that incredible Mercedes car, assuming it's still incredible next year. So the idea of changing of the guard is not just that, Lewis has some proper competition now, not just in the form of Max Verstappen, but also in terms of Lando, George Russell, the Ferrari drivers on occasion, also really showing signs of promise. So we have got a changing of the guard. It's coming. Lewis is coming towards the end of his career. Now, we're still seeing Lewis in top form most of the time right now. So I'm not saying he's starting to peter off, but this is what happens. This is the cycle of Formula One. You get drivers that have incredible success, and then towards the end of their career, inevitably, some younger kids come through, some other teams start to come through. The cycle changes, and you'll start to get consistent competition from outside of that Mercedes team, from outside of Lewis and his side of the garage, and eventually it's going to happen. The inevitable will happen, and he will be toppled. And that's what's happening right now. We're starting to see the early throes of it. And yes, I know Lewis won that Grand Prix, and he did it brilliantly in the end, but things are starting to turn. This period of domination for Lewis and Mercedes can't go on forever. And what we're witnessing right now are the early stages of that beginning to change. And I think it's fascinating to watch. It's the cycle of life, says Daniel McClellan. Yes, absolutely it is. Can't wait for next year. Is this the most talented grid ever, says Neil Williams. That's an interesting question. Obviously a kind of impossible one to actually answer, but what do you think? What are your feelings about that? I think we have got some incredibly talented drivers on the grid, and I think one of the most exciting things is that the young generation that's coming through is showing so much promise. As a Brit, we had 3 British drivers in the top 5 on Sunday. And that's amazing for the British race fans, British Formula One fans. The future of British motorsport, as Lewis Hamilton does potentially come towards the end of his career, is in good hands with Lando and George. I think we've got some promise coming through, together with some other younger drivers in the other categories that will find their way into the sport over the next few years, I'm sure. So it's a really exciting time, really talented grid. Can't wait for next year to see what happens with the cars, the drivers, the new rules. I think we're in for a proper treat. And this year, by the way, is not doing too badly either, is it? So let's see. So yeah, possibly we'll see with the new regs, ? Says Fire Up. Now, that's also interesting. I mean, I touched on this a couple of months back, I think, where this idea of the new regulations, which of course are all designed to improve the racing, to allow drivers to race more closely to each other with wheel-to-wheel racing and that kind of thing. That's the intention behind the 2022 regulations, together with cost caps and everything else. And yet, in 2021, we're seeing perhaps the closest racing, the most wheel-to-wheel racing, the most exciting racing we've seen for, I don't want to put a number on it, but a long, long time, many, many, many years, in my opinion. are we potentially setting ourselves up for disappointment with a new set of regulations that had the very best of intentions, but as typically happens, whenever you just leave a set of regulations alone for a long period of time, they stabilise, the performance begins to converge up and down the grid, and you typically get great racing. I'd love to know what you think on that. Are we potentially setting ourselves up for a fall? Should we just leave regulations alone, or are you keen that we continually keep moving forward, that we do experiment and make changes? Because if we leave things alone forever, the sport will gradually fall out of relevance, and other sports and motorsports potentially will be bigger, better, faster, more relevant to the wider world. So what do you think on that? It's an interesting question. I'll tell you what I think in a minute, but what do you think? And yes, thank you to whoever said that. Do hit the like button, please. That would be very appreciative, or I would be appreciative if you do it. 800 of you doing it, watching the video, 181 likes. So come on, we can do better than that. Smash that button, please. Thank you. So TJ930, I hope next year is fairly close. Absolutely. And of course, we all hope that next year is going to be fairly close. But the other element to new regulations is that everybody's looking at a brand new set of regs, and therefore there will be some slightly different interpretations of those up and down the grid. Somebody will probably do a better job than others, and therefore we might well get some more separation on the grid in terms of outright performance between front and rear, because some teams will get it wrong, some will get it right. And over time, if we leave those regulations stable, again, people will begin to converge in terms of performance. Agreed, we finally have great racing and F1's going to F it up, says Rob Graham. Well, let's not jump to conclusions. It may be absolutely brilliant next year. The intentions are really good behind what's happening next year. Even the science behind why we're designing the cars the way we are is great. The idea behind budget caps and performance levelers in terms of aero restriction, depending on where you finish. All of these ideas are all there with the right intentions, and in theory, they're all good. So we may well get another brilliant season next year, and let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's not write it off before we've had it, but it is brilliant right now. New regs, please. These cars suck, says Racer Gin 3D. Well, I'd love to know why you think these cars suck. I'll agree that they're too big, they're too heavy, but they're providing some spectacular racing right now. So, do they really suck, or should we be, reveling in what we've got? Our DRS trains close racing. Well, we're still going to have DRS next year, so that necessarily isn't going to change. It's not going to be the dramatic transformation to the way cars race next year that some people might be expecting. I think the idea is that it will close them up and allow them to be less affected by the aerodynamic turbulence off the car in front, but it's not going to dramatically change the face of Formula One to some enormous extent, I don't think. Yes, DRS trains are, if you take away DRS and you look at footage of F1 in years gone by, you still had long periods of cars in a train following each other where perhaps they can't get by for long periods of time. That's the nature of racing. But if they are in a DRS train, if they are close to each other, at least with that, we're allowing the cars to get as close as possible, and on certain circuits, make the lunge for the overtake. Perhaps the combination of some modern circuits together with modern Formula One cars, which might have outgrown some more traditional circuits, for example, we do struggle at certain racetracks. But look, the Sochi Autodrome is a dull racetrack. It's full of 90-degree corners. It's relatively flat. It's not in the most picturesque location in that sort of abandoned Olympic Park. It's a concrete jungle with very little soul. I've been there many, many times. I can tell you that from experience. We don't necessarily always get great racing there. And yet this weekend we had some fantastic racing and qualifying. And I know that the weather played a big part in that, but so what? The weather is something random that we could get at any point, at any racetrack, anywhere around the world. And this weekend we lucked in and got something amazing out of it. So I'm one of these people that tries to always find the positives in what we have. I know it's easy to complain about lots of things about Formula One, but let's just revel in the fact that we are witnessing an amazing season. in terms of the spectacle that we're all seeing. Even if you're a neutral, it's great. We're witnessing a battle between two of the sport's greatest drivers at the front for a title, separated by 2 points at this stage of the season. Amazing. How long have we been crying out for that? Those two drivers have gone wheel to wheel on a number of occasions and collided and even taken each other out of the race. Spectacular stuff. And we've got all kind of manner of drama going on behind them, and a changing of the guard, as I said, to look forward to over the coming months and years too. So there's an awful lot to be grateful for. We're witnessing the sport's greatest ever driver in terms of statistics, at least, coming towards the end of his career. And that's also something to behold and witness and be grateful that we're all privy to watching that. It's a privilege to be able to enjoy Formula One in its current state. Let's try not to forget that. Who will have a leg up in Turkey, Max or Lewis Hamilton? Very difficult to say. I would have always perhaps gone with Lewis. Lewis loves that racetrack. From the moment I saw him racing in GP2, before he'd even got into Formula One, it was Turkey, if you remember, where that very famous race where he was battling for the GP2 championship, spun the car early on and made his way right the way through the field in a car which was essentially the same as everyone else's, in an incredible display that really put Lewis Hamilton onto the map and certainly into the minds of the entire Formula One paddock as we watched from our F1 garages. He loves that racetrack. It's a great racetrack. We can definitely get some strange weather there, but it's also got some great features around the track too. So it's not a place you can't overtake on. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Who's going to come out on top? I mean, that's the beauty of this year. I really don't know. And even on racetracks where it's been historically a Lewis track or a Max track, particularly on the ones that have been historically Mercedes tracks, it's kind of showing up now that that's partly the case, at least because there was never any real major challenge from outside of Mercedes. So many tracks have been Mercedes tracks in the past, but now we've got a Red Bull that's a genuine contender. And that brings a number of these other racetracks back into to suit the characteristics of their now very fast car. That's what I love about it. We go to Turkey not really knowing who it's going to suit most, and I love that. Thoughts on Ferrari's new engine? Well, we haven't seen it yet, have we? So they will have a new power plant coming over the next few races whenever they introduce their next one, and the hope is, for them at least, that it is stronger. It's an upgrade. It's an improvement in certain areas. Not dramatic. You're not allowed to make dramatic improvements in a total redesign at this point, but there are some areas you can improve, and that's what they intend to do. So when we see it, we can judge it, but they are pinning a number of hopes on that, because clearly at times, and this weekend I think showed it, great start from Carlos Sainz, but he wasn't able to hold on to that through a combination of not having a fast enough car in a straight line, and also the fact they really are struggling with tyre wear, particularly front end tyre wear on their car. So they've got some balance issues, some setup issues, and the engine will be one of the things that they hope to add to their armoury to help overcome some of those. Did Hamilton win that GP2 Turkey race? He didn't win it, but I think he ended up about 17th or something after he spun, then he got back to second or third, I can't remember. But it was if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend just looking it up on YouTube, because it is spectacular. And when you're watching it, bear in mind, these are a grid full of standard cars. It's amazing. Right. Did you see Ferrari's old engine? Did I see Ferrari's old engine? Not sure what you mean there. I'm afraid, Vineeth Menon. Explain that and I'll answer it. I'm not sure about that one. Sorry, mate. Also, I've been seeing trucks washing the surface at least twice a week for the last month or so. So if you're talking about Turkey, Onur Kore, then yeah, sorry, I must have missed the first part of your conversation, but they are doing a lot of preparation, of course, right now ahead of the Turkish Grand Prix. So hopefully the track's in good shape. Let's see. Can we expect McLaren to make further car improvements to get on terms with the top two? Well, they'll always be looking for improvements, and improvements don't just come in the form of hardware and upgrades. And I think we're all aware now that almost everybody is switching if they haven't already, switched their full attention over to 2022's car now, rather than spending time researching and developing, spending wind tunnel time on the 21 car. And McLaren, I haven't heard whether they've actually completely switched over or not, but I'm pretty sure they will have done. So improvements may not be coming in the form of many new bits. There might be some in the system which will feed their way through, but there's still a huge amount of improvement that can be made in terms of how you operate the car, how you operate the engine, how the software that controls many of the features in the car works. That can be refined all the time, and there are people working on that. You know, things like setup improvements, stuff you can learn in the simulation process. They can be really significant when it comes to adding performance to a race car. So that will still be going on 100%. And they won't be just giving up in this fight. They've shown signs of promise, some amazing signs of performance. The other thing that does is, of course, really boost the team. And from that, you gain extra performance from a human perspective, from all areas of that organisation. So I touched on that last week. That 1-2 in Monza has given such a boost to the entire organisation. And you will see a change in results because of that, undoubtedly. You know, the human performance side of F1 is often underestimated outside of the driver environment. But actually, this is a team or teams of many hundreds, if not thousands of people. And therefore, the ability that those thousands of people have, the performance they bring every day at work, has a significant impact on the outcomes of the decisions and the things you do as an organisation. So we will see improvements off the back of what's been happening to McLaren already, and in fact, we probably already are. What would Bernie say about all this jazz? Says P1. All what jazz? Clarify that for me, and I will come back to you. Is Martin Whitmarsh outdated? Says Neil Williams. So what Martin Whitmarsh is now the big boss man of Aston Martin. So as in Aston Martin, the group. And I think, is he outdated? I don't think so. He's been out of this sport for some time on the front line. But, you know, running an organisation like that is not really about having a full up-to-date understanding of Formula One. It's about how to manage a huge organisation, a huge business. He's been doing that since he left Formula One. I have a huge amount of time and respect for Martin Whitmarsh, and I think he'll be a really strong addition to the Aston Martin group. So I can't wait to see what he does, and I'm sure we'll see him around the F1 paddock before long. Let's talk about Lewis Hamilton's 100th win, says Alex Lamas, and that's a very, very good point. Of course, we have to talk about that. I mean, I touched on Lewis a moment ago. We're witnessing and have been very lucky to witness, to be privileged to witness Lewis Hamilton's career. I've been, you know, incredibly privileged to be part of that right in the very beginning. And, you know, I count my lucky stars for that, because when this is all over, when Lewis has gone and left the sport and we've all grown old and we're looking back, like we do today around the people like Senna and Schumacher, we'll be looking back on Lewis Hamilton and saying what an incredible driver he was, one of the best the sport has ever witnessed. You know, one of the greatest sporting achievements, not just in F1, but in sport. And we've all been lucky enough to witness this happening all the way through. We mustn't take that for granted. You know, you can love or hate Lewis Hamilton from a fan's perspective, and we've got a very split crowd right now when it comes to Formula One. There's a massive camp with Lewis Hamilton's fans and a massive camp with Max Verstappen. And almost like a football crowd, there's a massive divide down the middle. And that's great, that's understandable, that adds to the drama and the theatre of the whole thing, it's brilliant. But I think no matter which side you're on, you have to try and respect what the other guy is doing. Max Verstappen, also an incredible driver at a very different stage of his career. We may well look back on Max in many years to come in the same light, depending on what he goes on to do. But right now, let's appreciate that Lewis Hamilton has just won his 100th Grand Prix. And I don't think that, certainly when I was at McLaren helping Lewis to win his first in Canada all those years ago, back in 2007, 100 was an impossible number. That wasn't even a number that anybody could fathom at that stage. That's something that was just pie in the sky thinking. And yet he's just gone on and done it. And yes, he's had a great car on occasions. Yes, he's had a great team. Yes, he may not have had outside competition on the same level on some of those seasons. It doesn't matter. Lewis Hamilton has delivered consistently over and over again to get 100 race victories, and you can't take that away from him. You know, I know he can split opinion on what people think of him as a person. I mean, that makes me laugh anyway, because how many people that have that opinion know him? How many people can have an opinion on Lewis as a person when all you get to see is one tiny little snippet on the TV on a Sunday afternoon and whatever little bits of media the tabloid newspapers like to write about him? I have a huge amount of respect for what Lewis Hamilton has achieved and is continuing to achieve. And let's not forget, he's getting to the latter stages of his career. He has got all of the accolades, all of the money, anything that you could have possibly dreamt as a youngster coming into this sport, and yet he still is getting up every day, dedicating his entire life to being the very best out there. He's revelling in the challenge from a Lando Norris and a Max Verstappen, and he wants to prove that he can still do it. Maybe he can, maybe he can't, but he's not going to give up, and that is also something that deserves massive respect. So a huge amount of time for Lewis, a huge amount of respect for what he's achieved, and my closing thoughts on that before I come to what you guys are saying is that, as I said earlier, we should all take a moment to appreciate what we've witnessed over the last few years and continue to witness in the presence of Lewis Hamilton, with his time in Formula One. What would you like to say to Lewis directly? Well, I did say stuff to Lewis Hamilton directly quite recently. Many of you know I spent a day with Lewis earlier this year, an entire day doing some filming, and I got to have some of the longest one-on-one contact with Lewis that I'd had, I think even including when I worked with him. When I worked with him, it was moments here or there where we get to talk about the car, but earlier this year I had a day with him filming for Mercedes, or for Petronas, and in all the breaks between filming we just sat and chatted about the old days. And I did say to him that, in fact what I said to him on that day was that first of all, that I have huge respect for what he's done, but I also wanted to let him know that all of the people at McLaren who were part of his early success, part of bringing him into the sport, and obviously part of that first championship, are also, even though he's now working for the enemy, the opposition, are also really proud to have been a small part in the journey that Lewis has gone on to have and the success that he's gone on to be. And I'm speaking on behalf of my former McLaren colleagues here, but I think I can say that with some confidence that most people in that team, in the McLaren team, feel incredibly proud to have been part of that journey. So that is exactly what I said to Lewis directly when we were hanging out earlier this year. Hang on, let me come back. Verstappen is a once-in-a-generation greatest talent around. Well, Verstappen is also something very, very special. And, we're witnessing some great drivers, as we said earlier on, and more coming through with the likes of George Russell, Lando, Daniel Ricciardo. I still think is one of the greatest drivers that we've had in Formula One. Hasn't yet had the results to back that up, but I still think he's one of the most exciting drivers to watch. And others. I think Charles Leclerc is hugely talented. Carlos Sainz really showing that he's got talent and starting to deliver on that promise. He just needs a better car at Ferrari. So some great talent throughout the field. And I don't mean to miss drivers off that list, but we'd be here all night otherwise. Is the Lewis Hamilton video publicly available? Well, it is, but that chat certainly wasn't part of the video. That was just a private chat we had. The videos that I did with Lewis were all on the Petronas channel, and it's just kind of race preview stuff. So it's very generic Formula One-y stuff rather than anything personal. So has anyone here driven an F1 car? I've driven an F2 car, says Harry Mogg. Well, I hope you enjoyed your experience in the F2 car, Harry. I haven't driven a Formula One car, and I'm gutted about that. I go to work now every day with Mike Brewer, who takes great delight in telling me that he's driven 2 Formula One cars. How's that been allowed to happen? That he's driven Formula One cars, and I've worked in the sport for 10 years and never driven one. So yes, I am gutted. Even Crofty's sat behind the wheel of a Formula One car and driven it. But no, I haven't, and it's a real shame. I'd love to. I've driven the simulators at McLaren, which were amazing, but never got the chance to drive a Formula One car. Harry says the F2 car scared the hell out of me. I'm sure it did. It's a powerful machine. Right. Where can we watch that day with Lewis? Well, as I said, yeah, you'll be very disappointed because it's just some very basic preview chat with Lewis around each racetrack, and I think it's going out still in the build-up to each Grand Prix on the Petronas channel, so on their YouTube channel or their socials. I'm not sure exactly where. Lewis is awesome at driving cars. What he's like in real life isn't applicable. Well, I mean, look, we can appreciate him in Formula One for how he's able to drive a Formula One car and the work he does in Formula One. But, you know, I can tell you from knowing him a little bit that he is a great guy and he's doing some amazing stuff outside of Formula One. So his personality and his character that somebody wants to judge from afar is irrelevant. You know, and that's the same for anybody who's judging someone with a snippet of information. But let's just appreciate Lewis for what he's brought to Formula One, what he continues to bring, and the entertainment that we've all had out the back of it. Can't we get McLaren to hook you up? Yes, please, Jamie. If McLaren want to hook me up with a drive in their F1 car, I would jump at the chance, but I think it's a long shot. Right. Bottas is Red Bull's third driver. So, yeah, a lot of people suggesting that tactical decision to put Bottas's engine in and send him to the back was made to somehow hamper Max. I really don't buy that. I really don't see that that's the case, if I'm honest. And if that was the case, he did a terrible job of it, didn't he? Because Verstappen sailed past him when he got close. So I don't think that was the reason. I think it was an opportunity with Max out the picture, as I said, to take another engine without needing Bottas in a fight against Max at the front of the field. That's what I think it was all about. Richard Hammond has driven an F1 car. Yep, I know. Yeah, lots of people have. I know it's not just Crofty and Mike Brewer. Lots of people have, just not me. What do you think has changed at Williams to give them the results they've had this year, considering the cars are fairly similar to last year's? So that's a good one to finish up on, really, as we're coming towards the end. Williams, giant leap forward, particularly in the hands of George Russell. So there's a couple of things, aren't there? They have, first of all, the team was taken over and had a huge amount of money invested in them last year from Dorilton Capital. That has an effect, and there's obviously a delay between that injection of cash and the effects happening, and that's happening now. We'll see an even bigger impact of that, of course, on the 2022 car next year. But more resources mean they're able to do a few more things, run simulations more often, more advanced simulations, probably bring more parts to the car early on. They've also brought in Jos Capito, and I can tell you from experience that Jos can have an immediate impact on a team's performance just because he promises so much coming into that organisation, and that's not false promises. He will back it up. He's a great guy, a great leader, and he comes in, he knows how to bind a team together. He did it at McLaren in the very short period of time that he was there, and I've no doubt he's doing it now at Williams. So that's another thing that will just boost everybody, together with the new ownership and the future looking bright for the organisation. Has an impact in the same way I talked about earlier as McLaren having that human performance boost off the back of that good news. They'll be having the same. Then the other thing, really, because that performance is obviously staggering in the case of George Russell. Well, George Russell has also had some amazing news recently, of course, but he's known that for some time, that he was going to Mercedes. He had that boost in confidence off the back of his run in the Mercedes last year when Lewis had COVID. So these things all play in, these little moments in time where you get a good result or you get everybody talking in a positive light about you as a driver. They all start to add up to, you know, a significant step, and that confidence can genuinely translate into what you do in the car. So the car's been improving, the team's been improving, and George, I'm sure, psychologically as well as building up his own experience, has been improving as well. And the combination of those three have taken a giant leap forward on certain occasions. It's still not, you know, he qualifies it on third place on Saturday. That was never going to be a car that was going to be able to stay there, but they are delivering over the course of one lap massively, and they're doing it consistently now, which is a real step forward. When it comes to next year and the 2022 car, that team will be in a far better position to hopefully capitalise on this sort of levelling of the playing field to some extent, and I'm really excited to see what they can do. Of course, losing George will be a blow to them next year, but from a George Russell perspective, he's moving up the grid, and I think we all as fans want to see that too. So lots to look forward to for next year from a Williams and a wider F1 perspective, I think. Right, we're coming towards the end. We've got 5 minutes. Smash that like button. Come on. There's about a third of you have hit the like button. Just hit the like. It takes you a second. You can do it right now. You don't have to leave the video. Just hit the like. I'd appreciate it. Let's see if we can get that number up before the end. Thank you. Right. Fantastic stream, Elvis. Thanks for your opinion, says Tim Hazelwood. Well, Tim, thank you. And to everybody, thanks for joining. I mean, these streams, first of all, I love doing them. The reason I love doing them is, A, I could talk about Formula One literally all day long if people are happy to listen. But the main reason is you lot. It's you lot joining me for this chat and jumping into the conversation and helping to shape the way this goes. So thank you for that kind comment, Tim. But thank you all for your consistent participation in these things. Because without you, it's kind of just me sitting here talking to myself. Is this close racing a result of the cost cap, says Redmond Barry? It's not, because the cost cap won't really have a major impact. It is having an impact this year, but the bigger impact will be on next year and the design of the 2022 cars. So I think that's when we're going to see the bigger impact. The biggest reason we're having close racing is literally because these cars have remained the same, or more or less the same, over a substantial period of time. And we had changes, don't forget, for these cars, but they were relatively minor. The power units have all started to equalise. The tyres have been relatively consistent now, and people are starting to understand more and more how to get the best out of them, and that's the biggest reason we're getting convergence in terms of performance. Right, let's see, we've got time for one more. Do you think Sebastian Vettel can be in the top 3 next year, says Luke Andrews? Can he be in the top 3? Sebastian Vettel certainly, I think, has enough of what it takes to get himself into the top 3 in a good car. What he seems to have struggled with, and I'm only having not worked with Sebastian, I'm looking in the same way you are from the outside, he seems to have struggled with consistency. And, you know, how many times have we seen him under pressure and then capitulating, spinning, crashing, going wheel to wheel and getting it wrong? And that's easy to look at from the outside and say Sebastian's lost it. It could also be that it's a very difficult car to drive, and let's face it, I'm sure that Aston Martin has been difficult over times. So I think he has what it takes, and if he gets a good car, there's no reason he can't be back up there. He's a 4-time world champion. You don't just lose that like that. Well, we're pretty much there, guys. I think that's going to have to be it. Lewis is a teammate killer? No, I don't think so. And we'll find out next year with George Russell, because that's going to be one of the most interesting dynamics next year for me. Not only how quick is George, how much is he going to push Lewis, but how does Lewis react, both in the car and psychologically and mentally, to having a teammate that potentially, and we don't know yet, potentially could challenge him on a more consistent basis than he's had for a long, long time. We'll have to wait and see. But look, it's something to look forward to. I'm really excited about it. But that's it, guys. I'm going to get a beer, and it's 11 o'clock, isn't it? So we started late, 11 o'clock. Thank you very much for joining. I hope that we get more races and race weekends like we had last time out. They won't all be as good as that, but let's try and appreciate what we're witnessing right now and not take it for granted. Let's try not to complain about too many elements of Formula One and just enjoy and celebrate the great bits. It won't always be like this. So enjoy it for what it is. Enjoy it until the next race, and let's see what we get next time. Thanks so much for joining me. Hit that like button. I'd really, really appreciate it. It would be wicked. And I'll see you again next week. Ta-da, folks.